Today, from Dr. Robert Jeffress on Pathway to Victory.
Listen to me, ladies and gentlemen. God is no respecter of persons, and He is no respecter of nations. The nation that honors God will be blessed by God. The nation that rebels against God will be judged by God.
Welcome to Pathway to Victory with author and pastor Dr. Robert Jeffress. The America we live in is but a faint shadow of what our founding fathers fought to establish. Everyday local and high court judges are busy redefining marriage, while politicians are working to silence Christians throughout the public square. Today on Pathway to Victory, Dr. Robert Jeffress calls America back to its Christian roots. Now here's our Bible teacher to introduce this special 4th of July message. Dr. Jeffress?
Yes, David. It is July 4th, and people are gathering in neighborhoods, parks, and backyards to relax with friends and family. I commend you for carving out a half hour today to spend with me on this very important edition of Pathway to Victory. During the next half hour, I'll guide you through a convincing list of reasons to affirm that America indeed was founded as a Christian nation. But first, I realize it is politically incorrect to say this, but it is nevertheless true. America was not founded as a Muslim nation. America was not founded as a Hindu nation. America was not founded as a nation that is neutral toward Christianity. America was founded as a Christian nation. And Today, we're going to discover that truth from history. First of all, let's talk about the Christian foundation of our country. Pastor, are you ignorant? Why in the world would you stand up and say this nation was founded as a Christian nation? We all know that our founding fathers were secularists and deists, not Christians. Well, let's look and see what the record of history says. Remember, David Barton was here a few months ago, and he pointed out that of the founding fathers, of those who framed our nation's constitution, we all know the handful, we can call their names, who were deists. But the vast majority of those who founded our nation were evangelical Christians. In fact, 52 out of the 55 signers of the Constitution, the framers of the Constitution, were evangelical believers. These very same men went on to form organizations like the American Bible Society, the American Tract Society, the Philadelphia Bible Society. These men were hardly neutral toward Christianity. Well, Pastor, that may be the personal beliefs of those who founded our nation. But what about the wall of separation between church and state? Isn't it true that our nation's forefathers wanted to build this wall that would prohibit Christianity from having any impact on public policy? You know, I am never cease to be amazed at the ignorance of the American public. Did you know a recent poll demonstrated that 67% of Americans believe the phrase separation of church and state is found in the First Amendment of the Constitution? That phrase isn't found in the First Amendment in the Constitution. It's not found anywhere in the Constitution. It doesn't appear anywhere. Well, where did that phrase originate? Where did it come from? Those of you who are students of American history know the answer to that. In the year 1800, Thomas Jefferson was the newly elected president of the United States. And a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, heard the rumor that Thomas Jefferson was going to establish the Congregational denomination as the state denomination. Now, you know how Baptists are. If they think anybody's going to be in charge except them, they get all upset, okay? And so they wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson protesting this rumor that the Congregational church was going to be the state church. And so Thomas Jefferson, on January the 1st, 1802, wrote this letter to the Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, and this is what Jefferson wrote, quote, "I contemplate with solemn reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should quote, make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. That's where you have the phrase. Thomas Jefferson writing a group of Baptists. Now, two things I want you to notice about Jefferson's comment. First of all, he was referring to an establishment of a denomination, not a religion. Jefferson said it that way. That was the whole context. He was saying we're not going to make one denomination the state denomination. But more importantly, what I want you to see is Thomas Jefferson used this phrase, separation of church and state, to reassure Christians of their freedom for religious expression. It was used to reassure Christians that government would do nothing to prohibit their free exercise of religion. People have now perverted Thomas Jefferson's words, and liberal groups today use those words to restrict Christians from the public expression of their religious beliefs. Secondly, consider how the court has interpreted this phrase, separation of church and state. This is so key to understand, ladies and gentlemen. For the first 140 years of our nation's history, the judiciary reaffirmed over and over again that this country is a uniquely Christian country. Well, Pastor, then how did we so pervert this wall of separation? When did it become the foundational principle of our judiciary? Did you know the first time the United States Supreme Court ever mentioned the separation of church and state was in 1947, 150 years after the ratification of the First Amendment? It was the first time it was ever mentioned. It was in a well-known case, Everson versus the Board of Education. And in this landmark case, the Supreme Court said it is illegal for New Jersey, the state of New Jersey, to use tax dollars to support a private parochial religious school. Now think with me for a moment. Back in 1947, all religious schools were basically of one faith. What faith was it? They were Catholic schools, all right? They were Catholic schools, and the United States Supreme Court said that we can't support Catholic schools. The man who wrote the court opinion was Justice Hugo Black. And he talked about how the, quote, wall must be kept high and impregnable. Some recent scholarship has revealed what Hugo Black was really up to. American University professor Daniel Dreisbach and University of Chicago law professor Philip Hamburger claimed that the Iron Curtain Black erected between Christianity and government was not Jefferson's wall, but it was Justice Hugo Black's wall. Quote, you can't understand the period when Justice Black was on the court without understanding the fear that American elites had of Catholic influence and power. Justice Hugo Black was an ex-member of the Ku Klux Klan. And if you know anything about the Ku Klux Klan, you will know the only people they hated worse than African Americans were Catholics. And thus, when Justice Hugo Black talked about the wall of separation from church and state, it was his anti-Catholic bias pouring out. And by the way, that's not just conjecture. Two current members of the Supreme Court agree. Justices Thomas and Scalia have both argued that this rabid desire to build this wall to protect sectarian groups from government was founded upon anti-Catholic bigotry. Justice Clarence Thomas said, quote, it was an open secret that sectarian was a code for Catholic. This doctrine of separation of church and state, born of bigotry, should be buried now. We have perverted what Thomas Jefferson believed. Since the Everson case in 1947, the courts have succeeded in their effort to build that wall higher and higher. In 1962, in the case of Engel versus Vitale, the Supreme Court ruled that students in New York could no longer recite the simple 22-word voluntary prayer. Quote, Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. The Supreme Court said it's unconstitutional for students to pray for themselves, their teachers, their parents, and for their country. 1971, the Supreme Court outlawed Bible reading, and in doing so, they actually quoted from a psychologist who said, and this is in the Supreme Court ruling, quote, "If portions of the New Testament were read without explanation, they could be and have been psychologically harmful to the children." Now compare that to what the Supreme Court had said 140 years earlier. Why should not the Bible, the New Testament, be read? Where can the principles of morality be found apart from the pages of the New Testament? 1967, a kindergarten teacher was having her students recite this poem. The poem said, "We thank you for the flowers so sweet. We thank you for the food we eat. We thank you for the birds that sing. We thank you for everything." The court said you cannot recite that poem in school because although the poem doesn't mention God, that poem may cause children to think about God, and that's unconstitutional. They outlawed the prayer. But the most outrageous ruling of all time, in my estimation, was the 1980 Supreme Court ruling Stone versus Graham. The case arose out of a Kentucky case in which copies of the Ten Commandments were being posted in the hallways of Kentucky schools. Now understand, nobody was ordered to read the Ten Commandments. No teacher taught about the Ten Commandments. They were simply being posted in the hallways of the Kentucky schools. And in Stone versus Graham, the Supreme Court said that's unconstitutional. What was the basis for their ruling? If I were to simply tell you, you would think I was making it up. So I'm going to read the court case to you, their ruling of why it's unconstitutional to post the Ten Commandments in school. The Supreme Court said, quote, "If the posted copies of the Ten Commandments are to have any effect at all, it will be to induce the school children to read, meditate upon, perhaps to venerate and obey the Ten Commandments. This is not a permissible state objective under the First Amendment." In other words, the court said, we can't do that. If we allow those Ten Commandments to be posted, students might actually read them, and heaven forbid, they might actually obey them. And that's unconstitutional. I thought of that ruling when I heard the news account you heard. Something that happened 17 years after that court ruling, strangely enough, in Kentucky. It was Heath High School in Paducah, Kentucky. The date was December the 1st, 1997. A group of high school students had gathered together before school in the hallway to read their Bible together and pray. As they were involved in their prayer meeting, joining hands, their eyes shut, a 14-year-old student approached them and opened fire on them, killing 3 students, seriously injuring 5 students. And it all took place in a school hallway where the Supreme Court said, you cannot post the words, "Thou shalt not kill." The wall continues. William Bennett, former Secretary of Education under President Reagan, observed in his report a few years ago, he called it the Index of Leading Cultural Indicators. And he notices what has happened in American history during those same years that the court started its all-out assault against the Christian faith. During the years 1960 to 1990, when the court outlawed Bible reading, prayer, the posting of the Ten Commandments, and on and on and on. Listen to what has happened during that same period of time. There has been a 560% increase in violent crime, a 400% increase in illegitimate births, a quadrupling of divorces, and an 80-point average drop in SAT scores. Today, 3.3 million teenagers are problem drinkers. 135,000 guns go to school every day, and 40 children are shot or killed. Just a coincidence? Not at all. God's word to Israel hundreds of years ago is applicable today as well. Remember what God said through the prophet Hosea? He said, "Because you have rejected knowledge, I will also reject you from being my priest. Since you have forgotten the law of your God, I will also forget your children. Since you have forgotten the law of your God, I will forget your children. Listen to me, ladies and gentlemen. God is no respecter of persons, and He is no respecter of nations. The nation that honors God will be blessed by God. The nation that rebels against God will be judged by God. Blessed be the nation whose God is the Lord. Ladies and gentlemen, just because we've changed our priorities does not mean God has changed His priorities. I want to suggest to you 3 questions you ought to ask yourself about anyone for whom you vote. Question number 1, write it down. Is the candidate a Christian? Is the candidate a Christian? Proverbs 29 verse 2 says, when the righteous rule, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan. You see, we believe that a Christian is a unique person. A Christian has been indwelt by the Spirit of God. A Christian is uniquely led by God. A Christian is favored by God. Why wouldn't we want a Christian instead of a non-Christian as our leader in any office? By the way, as I said earlier, John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, said the very same thing. Listen to what Justice Jay said. Providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is the duty as well as the privilege and interest of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for our rulers. Isn't that fascinating? John Jay said this is a Christian nation, and we have the right and the duty to prefer Christians as our rulers. Question number 2, does the candidate embrace biblical values? Does the candidate embrace biblical values? What do you do, Pastor, when you have all 4 people running for president and vice president claiming to be Christians? What do you do? Then you ask the question, do they embrace biblical values? For example, what do they say about abortion? The slaughter of tens of millions of innocent lives. What do they have to say about that? When asked the question, when does life begin? Do they waffle and waver and say, oh, that's a theological question, I don't know the answer to that? Or do they say life begins at conception? What do they say about that issue? Or what about the issue of the sanctity of marriage? What do they say about marriage? Do they say marriage is whatever you define it to be? Or do they say marriage is a unique union of a man and woman for life? Or what do they say about the unique heritage of our nation as a Christian nation? Do they stand up and do they say, America can no longer be called a Christian nation? It is a nation of Muslims and Hindus and other faiths. Is that what the candidate says? Or does the candidate say, yes, I believe America was uniquely founded on Judeo-Christian principles? But some of you are thinking, well, now, Pastor, why are you cherry-picking those issues? What about other issues like global warming or economic justice or tax policy? Doesn't God care about those things? Yes, He cares about those things. But the reason I mention these 3 issues are, these are the issues that made God's top 10 list called the 10 Commandments. God addressed the abortion issue when He said, you shall not murder. He addressed the sanctity of marriage when He said, you shall not commit adultery. He addressed the uniqueness of the worship of Jehovah God above all other gods when He said, you shall have no other gods before me. These are issues that matter to God. Does the candidate embrace biblical values? Number 3, how does the candidate's private faith influence his public policy? Does the candidate's faith impact his public policy? Anytime a so-called Christian stands up and says, well, I have this private, personal belief, but I don't allow it to influence my public policy, any candidate who says that is either a dishonest politician or a superficial Christian, okay? It's one or the other. Because the Bible teaches that our faith ought to impact every part of our life. Proverbs 3:5 says, in all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths. You know, as you look through the pages of the Old Testament, it's very clear. When a righteous king ruled like good King Josiah, God blessed the nation. When an evil king like Ahab ruled, God judged the nation. The king set the spiritual and moral direction of the country. Now today we no longer have kings, but we do have leaders who determine the spiritual and moral direction of our country through the policies they enact, through the justices they appoint to the court. Our rulers do determine the direction of our country. And listen to me, God has given to you and me the right and responsibility for selecting our leaders.